The meeting finished 4 minutes early. Not enough time to go back to your desk and do anything. Too much time to sit there in silence. So you're still in the conference room with your coworker from the floor above, someone you've spoken to maybe 8 times, and he's packing up slowly, and you are running the only small talk track you have. Long week? Yeah, long week. Almost Friday though. Yeah, almost Friday. And then both of you are looking at the table. The conversation closed like a door. You both know it. Neither of you says anything about it. He leaves first, and you spend the next 40 minutes at your desk doing something you could have done later because going back out there felt like too much. You have had this conversation 100 times. Same track, same wall, same silence you have to pretend isn't there. And the standard advice, ask questions, be curious, show interest, sounds right until you try it. Until you ask someone what they did on the weekend and they say, not much, and you say cool, and everyone moves on. The problem is not that you are bad at conversation. You are excellent at conversation. Ask you about something you actually care about, and you could go for an hour, get you alone with a close friend, and the words find their own shape without either of you having to manage it. The problem is small talk, specifically, the shallow end, the first 30 seconds before a conversation becomes real, if it ever does. And the reason that zone is so difficult has almost nothing to do with confidence or personality. It has to do with what happens inside a question, and what kind of question actually opens a door. Most questions close. That is the thing nobody says out loud. How was your weekend? Closes. It asks for a status report. The other person files one, good, busy, quiet, and hands the conversation back to you with nothing new in it. You are now exactly where you started, except the silence has a timestamp on it. This is not a personality problem. It is a structural one. The question itself has nowhere to go. There is a concept in conversational psychology called an open elaboration prompt. Plain version, a question that gives the other person something to push against, not just something to answer. Closed questions request information. Open elaboration prompts invite a person to think out loud, to follow a thread they did not know they were going to follow. The difference is not tone, it is not warmth, it is architecture. It is what the question is structurally asking the other person to do. How was your weekend? Asks for a verdict. What did you end up doing? Asks for a story. Any plans this weekend? Asks for a list. Anything you're actually looking forward to? Asks for an honest feeling. Same general territory, completely different architecture. One closes on contact, the other leaves a door open. And here is why this matters for you specifically. When you are in a low-stakes conversation with someone you do not know well, part of your brain is quietly doing threat assessment work in the background, not loudly, not in a way you can name in the moment, just a low hum of, is this safe? Is this going okay? Am I doing this right? That background process takes up processing power, which means the part of your brain responsible for spontaneous creative conversation, the part that would normally reach for a follow-up, find a thread, generate something real, is running on reduced capacity. This is why just be curious has never worked. Curiosity is not a switch. It is an output. It is what happens after your brain has enough signal to work with. When the question you asked produced nothing, a one-word answer, a dead end, a politely closed door, there is no signal, and a brain running half capacity on a conversation that already stalled has almost nothing to reach for. You were not failing to be curious. You were using questions that structurally prevented curiosity from having anything to attach to. So, if the question was always the problem, what makes a question work? Think about the last real conversation you had, not small talk, an actual conversation where time passed faster than you expected and you left feeling like yourself. Chances are you were not trying. You were not managing it. You were not monitoring whether you seemed interesting or whether the other person was engaged. You were just in it, following a thread because the thread was genuinely interesting to you. That is not a fluke. That is not luck. That is what you are actually capable of. And it shows up reliably whenever the conditions are right. One person you trust, a subject with some weight to it, no performance required. The gap between that version of you and the conference room version is not ability. You have the ability. It shows up constantly in the right conditions. The gap is entry point. Small talk, as it is usually practiced, has no entry point into anything real. It is a loop, status check, weather, weekend, back to work, and the loop is designed to stay shallow. Nobody built a door into it. So you keep arriving at the wall and concluding the wall is you. It is not you. It is the questions. And this is the part nobody talks about. The people who seem effortlessly good at small talk are not smarter or warmer or more naturally curious. They have mostly by accident, stumbled onto a small set of questions that open rather than close. They use them on repeat. They do not think of them as a technique. They just know, from experience, that certain questions produce conversations and certain questions produce silence. That set of questions is learnable, it is finite, and it does not require you to become a different person to use it. There are 4 of them, and the first time you use one and feel the conversation shift, open, loosen, go somewhere neither of you planned, you will understand exactly what has been missing. The 4 questions are not clever. That is the entire point. They are plain enough to say while your brain is barely online. They do not require you to have listened perfectly or to have thought of something interesting or to be in a good mood. They work in almost any low-stakes conversation, with almost any person, in almost any setting. What they have in common is architecture. Each one is built to invite the other person to say something they were not planning to say, which gives your brain actual material to work with. Here they are. What's that been like? Someone mentions anything, a new job, a move, a project they've been stuck on, a kid starting school. You say, what's that been like? That's it. No follow-up needed, no transition required. The question does all the work. It tells the other person, you are not looking for a summary, you are asking for their experience. And people almost always have something real to say about their experience. They just rarely get asked for it directly. Coworker mentions she's been covering for someone on leave for 3 weeks. You say, what's that been like? She exhales, tells you it's been a lot, tells you one specific thing that's been harder than expected. Now you have a real thread. Neighbor in the hallway mentions he's been renovating his kitchen for 2 months. What's that been like? He laughs, tells you something went wrong. Now you have a conversation. How long have you been doing that? Someone mentions a job, a hobby, a side project, a city they moved from. How long have you been doing that? It sounds almost too simple, but it pulls a timeline out of the other person, and timelines almost always contain a story. How they started, what changed, whether they planned it or it just happened. The question gives them a starting point and lets them decide how far back to go. You are at a family gathering. Someone you see twice a year mentions they picked up woodworking. How long have you been doing that? Suddenly there is context. Suddenly there is something to follow. Was it what you expected? This one works on anything the other person has already done or is currently in the middle of. A new role, a course they finished, a city they moved to, a decision they made. Was it what you expected? Invites honesty in a way that, how is it going? Never does. People almost always have a gap between expectation and reality, and when you ask them to compare the two, they usually find something worth saying. Colleague just finished a big presentation he'd been working on for weeks. Was it what you expected? He thinks for a second, says it went fine, but the reaction wasn't quite what he anticipated. You now have a real conversation, not because you were brilliant, but because the question opened a door he was not expecting. What's the hardest part? Save this one for moments when the other person has already said something real, something that signals they are willing to go slightly past the surface. What's the hardest part? Is the most direct of the 4. It asks for honesty plainly. Most people, when asked this directly in a low-pressure setting, will give you an honest answer. Not a deep one necessarily, but a true one. And a true answer is all a real conversation needs to start. Someone at a work event mentions they've been managing a team for the first time. What's the hardest part? They tell you something specific, something they probably haven't said to many people that day. Now here is why these work. Beyond just being better questions. Remember what happens to your brain in unfamiliar social territory, the threat monitoring hum in the background, the reduced capacity for spontaneous thought. These 4 questions bypass that problem entirely because they do not require you to generate anything creative. You are not producing a thought, you are issuing an invitation. And when the other person accepts that invitation and starts talking, your brain suddenly has input, real, specific, human input. And input is exactly what it needs to come back online. The conversation starts feeding itself. You ask one question, they say something real. You respond to what they actually said. You ask a natural follow-up, and this is the part that surprises people. The follow-up does not need to be clever either. Yeah, how did that go? Is enough, because by that point the other person is already in it, and so are you. Use these consistently across enough low-stakes moments and something quietly changes. The dread before the break room shrinks, not because you became more confident, Because you stopped arriving empty-handed. You now have 4 things to reach for. And that small, unremarkable moment, the one where you said something plain and the conversation opened anyway, is the exact thing you never believed was possible for you. What the people who seem naturally good at this have is repetition. Enough low-stakes moments that went somewhere, not brilliantly, just fine, that the next one feels less loaded. That is the whole difference. Not a gift, not a personality type, just accumulated evidence that conversations can open, and occasionally do, and that they had something to do with it. You have not had enough of those moments yet. That is all this is. 4 questions, plain enough to say when your brain is barely running, specific enough to actually work. Start with 1. Use it once this week in a moment you would normally escape. See what happens. You were never missing the instinct. You were missing the entry point. Now you have 4.